The sun bled out across the horizon, a deep, brutal red that painted the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory in shades of rust and blood. It was a painter's sky, but there was no poetry in it for Clay Morrison. For him, the sunset was just a clock, one that marked the end of another day of searing heat and silent toil. The light caught the dust kicked up by his horse, turning the air into a shimmering, gritty haze that settled over his land, his cabin, and the deep lines etched around his eyes. Clay's ranch was less a home and more a stubborn foothold against the wilderness. A small, sturdy cabin built of his own sweat and timber, a barn that leaned slightly as if tired of the wind, and a corral that held the few dozen head of cattle that were his life's sole ambition. He'd bought the land 10 years ago, a young man with a heart full of something he no longer recognized. Now, at 34, his heart was as hard and fallow as the sun-baked earth he worked. Love was a language he'd forgotten, a ghost he'd long since stopped looking for in the shadows. His days were a simple, repeating rhythm: rise before the sun, work the herd, mend the fences, and fall into his cot too tired to dream. His only companions were the ceaseless wind and a loneliness so profound it had become a part of him, like the callus on his hands or the squint in his gaze. He was riding the southern fence line, the one that bordered the true desert, a place where the scrub and rock gave way to nothing but sand and heat. The fence was his bulwark against chaos, the thin line of wire and wood that separated his meager order from the world's yawning indifference. His horse, a steady bay named Boulder, picked its way carefully over the rocky terrain. Clay's eyes scanned the taut wire, his mind on a loose post he needed to fix before morning. That's when he saw it, a splash of white against the ochre and brown of the landscape. It was wrong. White was the color of bone, of things long dead. He pulled Boulder to a halt, his hand instinctively resting on the stock of the rifle in its scabbard. He was a man who trusted nothing he didn't expect. Squinting against the glare, he saw the white shape move. It wasn't a bleached animal skull. It was fabric, and it was draped over a human form, slumped near a withered mesquite tree. He urged Boulder forward, his curiosity warring with a lifetime of hard-won caution. As he drew closer, the image resolved into something his mind could barely process. It was a woman, and she was wearing a wedding dress, or what was left of one. The lace was torn and snagged, the hem caked with a thick layer of mud and grime. The white was now a dirty, desperate gray. She was lying on her side, her face turned away from him, a mess of dark hair spilling into the dust. Clay dismounted, the crunch of his boots on the gravel sounding unnaturally loud in the immense silence. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. There was no response. He moved closer, his rifle now in his hand, held loosely at his side. He nudged her shoulder gently with the toe of his boot. "Ma'am, you alive?" A low moan escaped her lips, and she stirred. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Turning to face him, Clay felt a jolt, not of recognition but of sheer pity. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with dried tears. Her lips were cracked and swollen, her eyes sunken and hollow. She looked less like a bride and more like a wraith, a specter the desert had coughed up. She blinked at him, her gaze unfocused, as if she were looking right through him to a horror only she could see. "Water," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Clay holstered his rifle and unslung his canteen, his movement stiff and deliberate. He knelt, holding it to her lips. She drank greedily, spilling more than she swallowed, her hands trembling too much to hold it herself. When she'd had her fill, she sagged back against the tree, her breathing shallow. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. It was the only tone he had left. The woman took a moment to gather herself. When she spoke, her voice was faint, but the words were clear, edged with a refinement that felt out of place against the grit on her skin. "My name is Isabel." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was with a wagon train, heading west." "There ain't been a wagon train through this pass in months," Clay stated, his suspicion a hard knot in his gut. Tears welled in her eyes, carving fresh paths through the grime on her cheeks. "We took a southern route, a shortcut." Her story came out in broken pieces. She spoke of a fiancé, a man named Thomas, of a fever that had swept through their party, swift and merciless. Thomas had been among the first to fall, in the panic and fear, with the sick and dying. The party had pushed on, desperate to outrun the disease. They had promised to send help back for her from the next town, but they had left her with her dead fiancé and dwindling supplies. They never came back. It was a plausible enough tale. This land was full of stories of shortcuts that led to long graves, but something about her felt off. Her hands, though filthy, were slender and lacked the telltale signs of hard labor. Her speech was too soft. Still, he couldn't just leave her here for the coyotes. His conscience, buried as it was, wouldn't allow it. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded weakly, with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 10 years. Clay helped her to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird. He lifted her onto Boulder's back, then swung himself up behind her, settling her against his chest. She slumped against him immediately, her energy spent. He could feel the slightness of her frame, the faint, ragged rhythm of her breathing. He nudged Boulder into a slow walk, turning back toward the faint light of the lamp he'd left burning in his cabin window. The journey was silent, broken only by the plodding of hooves and the whisper of the wind. She felt like a stranger, an unwelcome complication. Yet, having another human being this close after so long was a strange and unsettling sensation. He'd give her a roof for a few days. He decided, just long enough for her to get her strength back. Then he would take her to the town of Redemption, 50 miles north. It had a church, a sheriff. Someone there could deal with her. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of solitude, and he would not let this ghost in a tattered wedding dress breach its walls. The cabin was a single room, stark and functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding a few books and tin plates. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and his own cot was in a far corner. On the other side of the room was a small, unused cot piled with old blankets. That would have to do for her. He helped her down from the horse and led her inside. She looked around the Spartan room, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Her vulnerability was a palpable thing, an aura of damage that made the air in the small cabin feel thick. "You can sleep there," he grunted, gesturing to the dusty cot. "There's a water pump out back, and a privy. I'll find you something to eat." He busied himself at the hearth, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to his own company. He sliced bacon into a skillet and mixed up some corn batter. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the way she stood uncertainly by the door, a statue of sorrow in his home. He noticed the way she moved, a clumsy, hesitant grace. When he handed her a plate of food, her fingers brushed his, and her touch was like a spark on dry tinder. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She ate slowly, without appetite, her eyes fixed on the floor. He saw then that she was not just a woman who was lost. She was a woman who was haunted. That night, the established order of his world was broken. For years, the only sounds in the cabin after dark were the pop and hiss of the dying fire, the sigh of the wind through the eaves, and his own steady breathing. But now, there was another sound. He lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, the space between them feeling as wide and as empty as the desert outside. He could hear the soft rustle of the blankets as she shifted on her cot. And then, he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it, a choked, muffled sob, quickly stifled. It was the sound of a grief so deep it could not be contained, yet so private it fought to remain hidden. Silence followed. Then another, a desperate intake of breath trying to swallow the pain. He lay perfectly still, his fists clenched at his sides. He was a man who fixed things, fences, pumps, harnesses. But this was a kind of brokenness he didn't know how to approach, a sorrow he wanted no part of. He closed his eyes, telling himself it was none of his concern. She was a temporary problem, a piece of flotsam washed up on his shore that the tide would soon reclaim. He would take her to town. He would go back to his silence. But as he lay there, listening to the quiet, desperate weeping that filled the dark corners of his home, Clay Morrison felt the first crack appear in the fortress he had built around his heart. For the first time in a very long time, he felt something other than the dull ache of his own loneliness. He felt the sharp, disquieting echo of someone else's, and it was a sound that would not let him sleep. The days that followed settled into a strange, silent rhythm. The wedding dress was burned, a necessary sacrifice to erase the most glaring evidence of her past. Clay gave her a simple chambray shirt and a pair of his old trousers, cinched at the waist with a length of rope. They were too large, hanging loosely on her slight frame. But they were the clothes of survival, not of ceremony. He had every intention of taking her to redemption, but a lame horse and a broken wagon wheel provided a convenient excuse for delay. In truth, a part of him was reluctant to return to the profound silence she had interrupted. He put her to work. A body needed to earn its keep on this land. He expected her to be useless, a delicate thing who would shy away from the grime and the labor. He was wrong. Isabel worked with a quiet, desperate intensity, as if she were trying to scrub away a stain on her soul. She was clumsy at first, her movements uncertain as she fed the chickens or tended the meager vegetable patch behind the cabin. But she learned quickly, her hands, once soft, becoming chapped and calloused. She never complained about the heat or the back-breaking work. She spoke little, offering only brief answers to his direct questions, her eyes always slightly averted. It was a penance, he realized. She was performing a penance for a sin he did not know. 2 weeks after her arrival, the wagon was fixed and the larder was nearly bare. The trip to redemption could be postponed no longer. They set out at dawn, Isabel sitting beside him on the wagon bench, a world of silence between them. The town was a day's ride away, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings that passed for civilization. The journey was tense. Clay kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw tight, while Isabel stared at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on the coarse fabric of his trousers. It was when they stopped to water the horses at a small creek that he saw it. She had rolled up the sleeves of the shirt to wash the dust from her face and arms. As she reached down to scoop water, the sunlight caught a mark on the inside of her left wrist. It was a small, silvery scar, shaped like a crescent moon. The world seemed to lurch to a halt. The sound of the creek, the buzzing of the flies, the heat of the sun, it all faded away. Clay was no longer a 34-year-old rancher standing on the edge of a dry creek bed. He was 20, a hired hand on the Grant family ranch, laughing with the owner's daughter, a girl with dark, wild hair and eyes that held a universe of mischief. He remembered a summer afternoon, a foolish attempt to teach her how to mend a saddle. The awl had slipped in her inexperienced hand, piercing the tender skin of her wrist. He remembered the single drop of blood, bright as a ruby, and the way she had laughed it off, even as he'd fussed over her, tying his own kerchief around the wound. Her name was... Clay squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head as if to dislodge the memory. No, it wasn't possible. That girl was gone, a part of a past he had buried under 10 years of solitude and hard labor. That life was over. He'd been told she'd married some rich merchant from back east, had forgotten all about the penniless ranch hand she'd once sworn she loved. The scar was a coincidence, a trick of the light, of a lonely mind grasping at ghosts. He didn't speak a word to her for the rest of the journey. In town, he was curt and dismissive, leaving her on the wagon while he loaded supplies. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a physical weight on his back. The suspicion was a live thing in his gut, a snake coiling in the darkness. He fought it, denied it, told himself he was a fool. To open that door again, to even consider the possibility, was to invite a pain he wasn't sure he could survive a second time. They rode back to the ranch under a sky bruised with the promise of a storm. The air grew thick and heavy, and the wind began to whip the dust into frantic spirals. By the time they reached the cabin, the first drops of rain were falling, fat and heavy, kicking up the scent of wet earth. That night, the storm broke with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting apart. Trapped by the deluge, they sat by the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of intimacy that felt both comforting and dangerous. The storm had stripped away the pretense of their daily routine, leaving them with nothing but the small space and the roaring silence between them. It was Clay who broke it, his voice low, barely audible above the storm. "This land, it takes things from you," he said, staring into the flames. "Takes your strength, your youth, takes the people you think you can't live without." Isabel didn't look at him, but she stopped pleating the edge of her blanket. "It gives nothing back," she whispered. "Sometimes it does," he countered, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "But what it gives back is never what you lost. It's scarred, changed." He was treading on dangerous ground, testing the edges of a truth he was terrified to confirm. "I knew a girl once, long time ago. Thought she was my whole world." He allowed himself a bitter, humorless smile. "A young man's foolishness. I was just a hired hand. Her father was a man of property. I wasn't good enough. She left without a word. Or maybe I was the one who abandoned her by not being enough. I never knew which." He risked a glance at her. In the flickering firelight, he saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek. Then another. A choked sob escaped her lips. The same sound he'd heard in the dead of night. But this time it was raw, unrestrained. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed to come from the very depths of her being. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to stay back, to let her be, but he couldn't. The sight of her pain, so intertwined with his own buried history, was a force stronger than his will. He moved from his chair to kneel on the hearth beside her. He reached out, his calloused, trembling hand covering hers. "Isabel?" he whispered, the name feeling both strange and familiar on his tongue. She looked up, her face a mask of anguish, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and in that moment, as the lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face, he saw it. Behind the exhaustion and the sorrow, behind the years of hardship, it was her. The same dark eyes, the same curve of her mouth. It was the face that had haunted his dreams for a decade. The air crackled with more than just the storm. It was thick with 10 years of unspoken words, of pain, of betrayal, of a love he thought he had successfully killed. He saw the recognition dawn in her eyes. Too, the truth was there, hanging between them, terrible and undeniable. He saw the tension in her jaw, the agony in her gaze, and beneath it all, something else, a flicker of the same desperate longing that was clawing its way up his own throat. He wanted to pull her close, to demand answers, to kiss her, to rage at her. The impulse was a physical thing, a fire that threatened to consume them both. But the chasm of time and pain between them was too wide. The weight of their shared past was a crushing presence. The moment stretched, taut and unbearable, a silent battle of grief and desire. Then, as if by mutual consent, the spell was broken. She pulled her hand from his, a shudder racking her body. He recoiled as if struck. Moving back to his side of the hearth, the fire popped, a lonely sound in the sudden, deafening silence. Neither of them slept. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. But inside the cabin, The atmosphere was more turbulent than ever. Isabel was a different person. The fragile, quiet woman was gone, replaced by someone brittle and cold. She moved with a rigid efficiency, her eyes hard as stone. She refused to meet his gaze, and when he tried to speak to her, her answers were clipped and dismissive. She was punishing herself. He knew. She was building her walls back up, higher and thicker than before, and in doing so, she was daring him to try and tear his own down. The cold front that had settled between Clay and Isabel was more unyielding than any winter storm. The cabin, once a space of simple solitude, was now a charged and suffocating prison of unspoken truths. He worked himself to the bone, hoping to exhaust the questions that gnawed at him. But every glance her way, every familiar gesture, every haunted look in her eyes, only tightened the knot of suspicion in his chest. He couldn't live like this, suspended between a ghost and a woman. He needed proof. He needed to put the past in its grave, once and for all, or watch it rise up and consume him. 3 days after the storm, he told her he was riding to Redemption for supplies he didn't need. The last storm washed out a section of the northern road. I need to get wire and staples before the herd finds the gap. He lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He couldn't look at her as he said it. She simply nodded, her face an unreadable mask, and went back to kneading dough for their bread. The sight of her performing this simple, domestic act in his home, while harboring a universe of secrets, filled him with a cold, simmering rage. The ride to town was a fury of dust and hooves. He pushed Boulder harder than he should have, the frantic pace a poor match for the turmoil in his own mind. His first stop was not the general store, but the small, clapboard building that served as the town's post office and telegraph station. Jedediah, the postmaster, was a wiry old man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Jed," Clay began, trying to sound casual. "Thinking back, that woman I brought in a few weeks ago, Isabel, did you ever hear anything more about that wagon train of hers, the one that had the fever?" Jed squinted, scratching his beard. "Can't say that I have. Clay, no mail, no telegrams. It's like they vanished into thin air. Odd thing, that—" She mentioned a fiancé, Thomas. Clay pressed. "Maybe you have a letter waiting for him. Or for her, under his name." Jed shuffled through a small stack of mail. "Nope, nothing for any Thomas, nothing for any Isabel. Save what you bought her. It's a sad business, but this land swallows people whole. You know that as well as I do." Clay left, a sense of frustrated dread growing within him. His next stop was the church, a modest structure with a steeple that looked bravely out of place against the vast, empty sky. Reverend Miller was tending a small garden of wilted-looking roses beside the parish house. He was a kind man, his face a roadmap of gentle wrinkles. "Clay, good to see you. It's not Sunday." The Reverend greeted him with a warm smile. "Reverend, I have a question, if you don't mind. A matter of tying up a loose end." He repeated the story of Isabel, the wagon train, the fever, the fiancé named Thomas who had died. "I was wondering if you had any record of his burial. She doesn't know where he was laid to rest." The Reverend's face grew somber. "A terrible tragedy. Let me check my records." He led Clay into a small, dusty office filled with the scent of old paper and beeswax. He pulled a large, leather-bound ledger from a shelf and ran a gnarled finger down the pages listing births, marriages, and deaths for the past year. "No, I have no record of a Thomas buried anywhere near here. In fact, I haven't presided over a fever burial in months." "Thank the Lord. Are you sure that was his name?" Clay's heart hammered against his ribs. The lie was unraveling. "I'm sure," he said, his voice tight. An idea, cold and sharp, cut through his confusion. "Reverend, you've been here a long time. You remember the families in this territory. Do you remember the Grant family? Had a large ranch south of here, about 10, maybe 11 years ago." Reverend Miller looked up from his ledger. His eyes clouded with memory. The Grants. Of course, Arthur Grant, a hard man. But he built a fine ranch, had a wife who was always ailing and a daughter. A spirited girl, Isabel, that was her name. The Reverend paused, his brow furrowing. A sad business. There was a scandal. It was all hushed up. Of course, but folks talked. The girl was sent away back east in a hurry. Disgrace the family, they said. The air in the small office was suddenly too thin to breathe. A scandal? Clay managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. The Reverend looked at him with pity. There was talk of a man, not a suitable match, just a hired hand who worked on their land. Arthur Grant would never have stood for it. He sent the girl away and sold the ranch not long after. Moved his wife to California for her health. I heard. The name, her name, Isabel Grant. The truth was a brand, searing itself into his mind. He wasn't a fool. He wasn't imagining things. The woman sleeping under his roof, the woman with the crescent-shaped scar on her wrist, was the same girl he had loved with all the fierce, desperate hope of his youth. And she had been lying to him since the moment he found her. He mumbled his thanks to the Reverend and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight. The ride back to the ranch was a descent into hell. Every beat of Boulder's hooves was a hammer blow against his skull. 10 years. 10 years of a bitter, lonely life. All of it built on the foundation of her abandonment. He had grieved for her, cursed her, and finally buried her memory under layers of hard work and cynicism. And now she was back, not as a ghost, but as a liar. The pain was a sharp, physical thing, but beneath it, something hotter and more potent burned. Rage. White hot, blinding rage at her deception. He found her in the barn, forking fresh hay into a stall. The late afternoon light slanted through the gaps in the wooden planks, striping the dusty air with gold. She looked up as he entered, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. He stalked toward her, his boots heavy on the packed earth floor. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough to see the pulse fluttering in her throat. Isabel Grant, he said. The name fell from his lips like a stone. She flinched as if he had struck her. The pitchfork clattered from her nerveless fingers. The color drained from her face, leaving it a stark, ghostly white. Clay, Don't, he snarled, his voice a low growl of contained violence. Don't you dare say another word of your lies to me. The fever, the wagon train, Thomas, was any of it real? Tears welled in her eyes, but he felt no pity. Some of it. 10 years, he bit out, the words tearing from his throat. 10 years I've been here, turning this dust into something, while you were, where? Married to your rich merchant. Did you ever once think of the fool you left behind without so much as a goodbye? It wasn't like that, she cried, her voice breaking. Then what was it like? He roared, taking a step closer, backing her against the rough wood of the stall. What kind of cruel game is this? To come back here, to my home, and pretend to be a stranger? Did you get a laugh out of it, watching me, wondering if I'd ever figure it out? The dam of her composure finally broke. A decade of buried agony poured out of her. There was no game, she sobbed, sinking to her knees in the hay. I was with child, Clay. I was carrying your son. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and the rage from his heart. He stared down at her, his mind reeling, unable to process what she had just said. His son. My father found out, she continued, her voice choked and raw, the story tumbling out in a torrent of pain. He called you nothing but a hired hand with dirt under his nails. He said you would ruin me, ruin our family name. He locked me in my room. He told me he would see you dead if I ever tried to contact you. She looked up at him, her face ravaged by a grief so old and so deep it seemed to have hollowed her out from the inside. He put me on a stagecoach with a chaperone and a little money and sent me to a distant cousin in the East. I wrote to you, Clay, I swear it. I wrote every day for a month, begging you to understand, telling you to wait for me. He found the letters. My father, he burned them. He burned them all in front of me and told me you were a chapter that was closed forever. Clay felt his legs give way and he sank to his knees in front of her. The barn, the ranch, the entire world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of shared history and unimaginable pain. The baby, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. Our son. A fresh wave of sobs shook her entire body. I ran away from my cousin's house. I couldn't bear it. I tried to come back. I used the last of my money to join a small group heading west. I thought if I could just get to Arizona, I could find you. Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, laden with a horror that chilled him to the bone. We were caught in an early snow in the mountains. There was never enough food. He was so small, so cold. She didn't need to finish. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them, more devastating than any sound. The child he never knew he had was gone, lost to the cold and the wilderness. A tiny ghost in a history he hadn't known was his. I'm sorry, she wept, her hands clutching at the hay. I'm so sorry. Clay, I never wanted to lie. When you found me, I was broken. I thought you'd hate me if you knew. I don't expect you to love me. I don't even ask for your forgiveness. She looked at him, her eyes empty of everything but a profound, aching despair. I wanted to die here, in this land, near you. That's all I had left. Something inside Clay Morrison, something that had been frozen solid for 10 years, finally shattered. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, animal cry of a pain too immense to bear. And then, for the first time since he was a boy, he wept. Tears he didn't know he had left streamed down his face, carving paths through the dust and grime of a decade of loneliness. He cried for the girl he had lost, for the woman she had become, for the son he had never held, and for the life that had been stolen from them both. He reached for her, his hands shaking. He pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him. They knelt there, in the dust and the hay of the barn, clinging to each other, two shattered souls adrift in an ocean of grief. It was not a lover's embrace. It was the desperate clutch of survivors, and in that moment of shared agony, amidst the wreckage of their past, a fragile, painful, and terrifying forgiveness was born. The confession in the barn did not heal them. It shattered them in a new and more complicated way. The silence that had been a wall of secrets was replaced by a silence of shared, unbearable pain. Isabel remained, but she was no longer a stranger he had rescued. She was the ghost of his past, living and breathing in the heart of his solitude, a constant, agonizing reminder of all he had lost. They fell into a new, fragile routine, two planets orbiting a dead star. They worked side by side, mending fences, tending the cattle, their hands sometimes brushing, a jolt of lightning passing between them before they pulled away. They ate their meals at the same rough-hewn table, the clink of a fork on a plate sounding as loud as a gunshot in the thick silence. He would watch her, the way she moved with a grace that even 10 years of hardship hadn't erased, and a profound guilt would wash over him. Guilt for the softness that had been stolen from her, for the terror she had endured alone, for the son whose face he would never see. She would feel his eyes on her and flinch, her shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. She still hadn't forgiven herself. In her own mind, she was a fallen woman, the source of a scandal, the mother who had failed to protect her child. She believed she was unworthy of the roof over her head, let alone his kindness. On their infrequent trips to redemption, the whispers followed them like blowflies. Clay, a man who had kept to himself for a decade, was now the subject of intense speculation. He would see the townsfolk watching from behind curtains, their heads together in gossip. Isabel, with her haunted eyes and her tattered, borrowed clothes, was a figure of tragic mystery. That's the one Morrison found in the desert. They'd murmur, a runaway bride, they say. The story had taken on a life of its own, a piece of grim folklore. Clay ignored them, his face a mask of stone, but he felt the weight of their judgment, another burden laid upon their already broken backs. They were an island, the two of them, and the rest of the world was a hostile sea. The weeks bled into a month. The raw, open wound of their shared history began to scar over, but the ache remained, deep in the bone. They were together, yet utterly alone. One night, under the sliver of a new moon that offered no light, they worked late, reinforcing the corral after a coyote had spooked the herd. The work was hard, their bodies moving in a familiar, synchronized rhythm born of shared labor. When they were finished, they were both bone-weary and covered in sweat and dust. Clay lit a small fire outside the cabin, not for warmth, but for the simple comfort of its light against the oppressive, starless dark. He brought out the bottle of whiskey he rarely touched and 2 tin cups. He passed a cup to her without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact lingered for a heartbeat too long, a silent acknowledgement of the current that always flowed just beneath the surface. They sat on an old log, sipping the whiskey, watching the flames dance. The spirit was harsh and fiery, burning a path down their throats, loosening the knots of tension in their shoulders. For a long time they just sat, listening to the night sounds, the crickets, the distant howl of a lone wolf, the soft shuffling and snorts of the horses in the newly secured corral. The silence between them felt different tonight, not heavy and suffocating, but thin, almost translucent. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a ghost or a regret, but as the woman sitting beside him in the firelight. The flames painted her face in shifting shades of gold and shadow, highlighting the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw not just the tragedy, but the strength that had allowed her to survive it. He saw the girl he had loved, hidden beneath the woman she had been forced to become. "Your hair is getting long," he said, his voice raspy. She instinctively raised a hand to a loose strand that had escaped her braid. "I should cut it." "No," he said, the word coming out faster, sharper than he intended. "Don't!" He reached out, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. His calloused fingers, clumsy from years of handling rope and iron, gently touched the stray lock of hair. It was as soft as he remembered, a lifetime of longing, a decade of repressed grief, surged through him at that simple touch. Isabel froze, her breath catching in her throat, but she did not move. Her eyes were fixed on his, wide and dark in the flickering light. His hand slid from her hair to cup her cheek. His thumb stroked the smooth, cool skin just beneath her eye. He felt a slight tremor run through her. She closed her eyes, a gesture of complete, terrifying surrender. In that moment, the years of pain, the lies, the secrets, all of it fell away. There was only the man and the woman, the boy and the girl, under a vast and empty sky. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was 10 years of unspoken words, of anger and forgiveness, of grief and hope, all colliding in a single searing moment. She responded with an equal, desperate hunger, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. The whiskey cups fell to the dust, forgotten. It was a clumsy, raw, and profoundly emotional reclaiming of what had been stolen from them. On a rough wool blanket spread on the hard-packed earth, with the scent of wood smoke in the air and the wind whispering through the sagebrush, they came together not just as lovers, but as survivors finding a desperate, vital solace in each other's arms. It was a moment of pure, untamed wilderness, as elemental as the land around them, a fierce and fragile act of life in the face of so much death. Every touch was a question, every caress an answer. It was a frantic, tear-soaked absolution, a silent promise that they were no longer alone in their pain. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blanket, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. A profound stillness settled over Clay, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in 10 years. It felt right, inevitable. He was home, in a way he hadn't been since the day she'd left. He turned to look at her, expecting to see that same peace reflected in her eyes. Instead, he saw terror. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. She scrambled away from him, pulling the blanket around her like a shield. "Isabel," he whispered, confused. "I can't," she breathed, shaking her head, her whole body trembling. "I can't." Before he could react, she was on her feet, stumbling toward the cabin. He heard the door creak open, then slam shut. He lay there, stunned, the warmth of her body already fading from his skin, replaced by a deep, chilling cold. What had he done? He had thought it was a healing, a new beginning, but the look in her eyes, it was the look of someone who had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. He threw on his trousers and followed her to the cabin. The door was ajar. Inside, she was gone. The cot where she slept was empty. A sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and the first drops of a cold, hard rain began to fall. Panic seized him. Where would she go? And then he knew there was only one place that belonged only to them, a sanctuary from a lifetime ago. He didn't hesitate. He ran to the corral, saddling Boulder with frantic, shaking hands. He rode out into the burgeoning storm, the rain lashing at his face, blinding him. He urged the horse on, his heart pounding with a singular, desperate fear that he had finally found her again, only to lose her for good. He found her in the heart of the storm, a small, huddled figure at the base of a giant, ancient oak tree 2 miles from the cabin. She was soaked to the bone, her arms wrapped around her knees, shivering uncontrollably. This was their tree, the place he had first kissed her, the place where they had carved their initials into the bark, the place where they had sworn they would love each other forever. He dismounted and walked toward her, the rain plastering his hair to his skull, his boots sinking into the mud. He saw her face, pale and streaked with rain and tears, and understood. This wasn't about him. It was about her. She had come to the heart of their past to punish herself for daring to feel a moment of happiness in the present. "Isabel," he called out, his voice hoarse against the roar of the wind and rain. It wasn't pity. He led her back through the driving rain, his hand firm in hers, a silent anchor in the storm. Back in the cabin, he toweled her hair dry with a rough but gentle touch, his words from the oak tree hanging in the air between them. It wasn't pity. He had said it with a conviction that had finally broken through her wall of self-loathing. He had seen her, not her tragedy, as she sat wrapped in a dry blanket by the fire, sipping a hot cup of coffee. A fragile truce settled in her heart. For the first time in a decade, she allowed a dangerous seedling of hope to take root. The next morning, Clay began his true answer. He took his axe and his saw and walked to the stand of pine trees at the edge of his property. He started felling them, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing across the land. For a week, he worked from sunup to sundown, hewing logs, notching their ends with a practiced skill she had never seen. He was not mending a fence or building a corral. He was adding onto the cabin. Without discussion or debate, he was building her a room. It was a declaration, louder than any words. The single room of the cabin had been the shape of his solitude. This new room was a promise, a physical claim on the future. As she watched him work, his muscles straining as he lifted the heavy logs into place, Isabel felt the last of her ghostly transience begin to fade. She belonged. The sound of his hammer driving pegs into the wood was the sound of a foundation being laid, not just for a wall, but for a life. She helped where she could, bringing him water, holding boards steady. Her presence, a quiet partnership. They were building a home. But as the walls of their sanctuary went up, the walls of the world outside seemed to close in. The gossip in redemption had festered from idle speculation into a dark, accepted truth. She was no longer just the lost bride. She was Isabel Grant, the disgraced daughter of a once prominent family, a fallen woman who had returned from the wilderness to live in sin with the reclusive Clay Morrison. On their supply runs, the whispers were a constant venomous hiss. Women from the church would pull their children closer as she passed, their face masks of pious judgment. Men in the saloon would stop talking when Clay entered, their stares a mixture of contempt and crude curiosity. Their isolation was complete. The ranch was no longer just their home. It was their fortress against a hostile world. One afternoon, a buggy rattled up the path to the cabin. It was Reverend Miller. He sat with them at their small table, his Bible resting between his clasped hands, his face etched with sincere concern. "My children," he began, his voice gentle, "the Lord works in mysterious ways, and he is a font of infinite forgiveness. But the town, people have long memories and short imaginations. There is talk, uncharitable talk." "We don't pay it any mind, Reverend," Clay said, his voice level. "But you must," the Reverend insisted. "For Isabel's sake, for the sake of your souls. The community is troubled by your arrangement. They see a woman of good family, touched by scandal, living under your roof unmarried. It is an affront to decency in their eyes." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I have a solution, a path to redemption. Let Isabel be baptized anew in the church, a washing away of the past, and then let me join the two of you in holy matrimony. A wedding would silence the gossip. It would legitimize your life together, set things right in the eyes of God and man." Clay looked at Isabel. He saw a flicker of the old fear in her eyes, the fear of being trapped, of being defined by others. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Reverend, I thank you for your concern," Clay said, his tone firm but respectful. "But we won't be getting married to please the town. Isabel has spent the last 10 years of her life paying for the judgments of others. I will not have her enter into a marriage that feels like another cage, another penance. If and when we marry, it will be because we choose it, for ourselves and no one else. What happens under this roof is between us and God, not us and the town of redemption." The Reverend left, his good intentions rebuffed, and a new, stronger bond settled between Clay and Isabel. He had defended not just her, but her freedom. He had declared that her past did not define her future. Their peace, however, was short-lived. A week later, another rider approached the ranch. This was no dusty cowboy or traveling preacher. He rode a fine black mare with a polished saddle and wore a dark wool coat and a bowler hat, both absurdly out of place in the Arizona heat. He dismounted with a stiff, formal grace and surveyed the rustic cabin and the half-finished new room with an air of unconcealed disdain. Isabel was outside, hanging laundry on a line. When she saw him, the color drained from her face. She dropped a wet sheet into the dust and took a half-step backward, her hand flying to her throat. Clay came out of the cabin, wiping his hands on his trousers. His eyes narrowed at the stranger. "Can I help you?" Clay asked, his tone unwelcoming. The man's gaze flickered over Clay, dismissing him as little more than a piece of the landscape. His eyes were fixed on Isabel. "Isabel," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "It has been a long time, I must say. This rustic existence does not become you."
"Elias,"
she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips.
"What are you doing here?"
"My name is Elias Vance," the man said, turning his cold, gray eyes to Clay. "And I have come to collect my betrothed." Clay moved to stand between Elias and Isabel. "You've made a mistake, mister. There's no one here for you to collect." Elias Vance gave a thin, condescending smile. "I assure you, there is no mistake. Isabel's father, Mr. Arthur Grant, and my own father signed a contract of betrothal when Isabel was 16 years of age, a binding agreement between our two families, an agreement I have come to honor." He looked past Clay to Isabel, his voice softening with a false veneer of sympathy. "I heard the terrible rumors of your misfortunes. My dear, I have spent months searching for you. It is my duty to bring you home, back to the East, where we can be married and this whole unfortunate episode can be put behind us. Your family's honor demands it." He spoke of her as if she were a lost piece of luggage, a stray animal to be returned to its rightful owner. He ignored Clay completely, directing all his words to her, his tone leaving no room for argument.
"I am not going with you, Elias,"
Isabel said, her voice shaking but firm. She took a step forward, to stand beside Clay. "That life is over. My home is here now." Elias's smile vanished. "Your home? With this person? Isabel, you are overwrought. This is a matter of law and family honor. The contract is ironclad. You have no choice." "She made her choice," Clay said, his voice a low growl. "You heard her. Now get on your horse and ride out." For the first time, Elias Vance truly looked at Clay, his eyes filled with the arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. "You will not interfere. This is a matter for her and for me, a matter for our class of people. You are a hired hand. You have no say." The old insult, the same one that had cost Clay his entire world 10 years ago, hung in the air. Clay felt a familiar, hot rage begin to boil in his blood. He knew that this man, with his laws and his contracts, would never be swayed by reason. He would use his money and influence to crush them, to take Isabel away as surely as her father had. There was only one law that men like Elias Vance didn't understand, but were forced to respect: the law of the West. Clay took a deliberate step forward, planting his feet firmly in the dust. "Where I come from," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "a man's home is his own, and the woman he loves isn't a piece of property. Your contracts and your honor don't mean a thing out here." He looked Elias Vance square in the eye. "But I'll make you a deal you can understand. We settle this man to man. No lawyers, no contracts, just you and me." A flicker of confusion, then amusement, crossed Elias's face. "Settle this? How?" "A fight," Clay said simply. "Here and now. We fight for the right to decide her future. If you win, she's free to go with you, if she so chooses. But if I win, you get on that fine horse of yours. You ride back east, and you never show your face on this land again." Elias Vance looked from Clay's hard, determined face to Isabel's terrified one, and a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his lips. "A fight?" he scoffed, the sound a dry rustle of condescension. "How utterly primitive. You people out here truly are a different breed." He began to remove his wool coat with a deliberate, theatrical slowness, folding it neatly and placing it on his saddle. "Very well. If a bit of rustic barbarism is what it takes to remind this woman of her obligations, then I shall indulge you." He was not a large man, but he was wiry and moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent time in fencing schools and boxing gymnasiums. He rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing surprisingly toned forearms. Clay, in contrast, simply stood his ground, his body a study in coiled tension. He was not a trained fighter, but his strength was forged from a decade of wrestling steers, swinging an axe, and forcing a living from an unforgiving land. This was not a sport for him. It was survival. Isabel stood frozen near the door of the cabin, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. This was her fault. This was the past, risen up in a tailored suit, come to claim its due in blood and dust. Elias struck first, a quick, precise jab that caught Clay on the cheekbone. It was a stinging blow, meant to humiliate as much as to hurt. Clay grunted, shaking his head to clear it, tasting the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. He had expected a brawler, but Elias was fast, his fists moving like a snake's strike. Clay lunged, trying to use his superior weight and strength to overpower the smaller man. But Elias was nimble, sidestepping the clumsy charge and landing another sharp blow to Clay's ribs. "Is this the best the Great West has to offer?" Elias taunted, a cruel smile on his face. "A slow, lumbering beast of burden." Clay ignored the words, his focus narrowing. He had let his anger make him reckless. He needed to be smarter. He stopped charging and began to watch, to wait, letting Elias dance around him. He took another punch, this one to his jaw, but as Elias pulled his arm back, Clay saw his opening. He lunged forward, not with his fists, but with his whole body, tackling Elias around the waist and driving him into the unforgiving earth. The fight devolved from a boxing match into a desperate, grunting struggle in the dust. The man's polish and training meant nothing here. This was about raw strength and the will to endure. Clay was stronger. He pinned Elias. His forearm pressed against the man's throat. Elias's face began to turn a dusky red, his eyes bulging with panic. "Give up!" Clay growled, the dust and sweat making his voice a raw rasp. "Ride out. Leave her be." For a moment, he thought Elias would yield, but then, with a desperate surge of energy, Elias twisted, his hands scrabbling at the ground. He came up with a jagged piece of firewood, left over from the construction of the new room. He swung it wildly, the sharp edge of the splintered wood catching Clay high on his left shoulder. A searing, white-hot pain shot through Clay's arm. He cried out, stumbling back, clutching the wound. Blood, dark and shockingly red, soaked through the fabric of his shirt. Isabel screamed his name, a sound of pure agony. Seeing his advantage, Elias scrambled to his feet, the piece of wood held like a club. His face was no longer arrogant, but twisted into a mask of desperate fury. "You should have stayed in your place, you filthy peasant," he snarled, advancing on the wounded Clay. But the sight of his own blood, of Isabel's terror, had a clarifying effect on Clay. The pain was immense, but it burned away the last of his hesitation. This was not about a contract or a point of honor. This was for Isabel, for the son they never had, for the future they were trying to build from the ashes of their past. He straightened up, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his eyes burning with a cold, clear fire that made Elias hesitate. As Elias swung the club again, Clay moved inside the arc of the blow, absorbing a glancing impact on his good shoulder. He drove his right fist, powered by a decade of grief and righteous fury, straight into Elias Vance's jaw. The crack of bone on bone was a sickeningly final sound. Elias's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into the dust like a puppet with its strings cut. He was not dead, but his will and his jaw were broken. Clay stood over him, panting, the world swaying in a haze of pain. The fight was over. Isabel rushed to him, her face a mess of tears and dust. "Clay, oh God, you're bleeding." She tried to touch his shoulder, her hands trembling. He swayed, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, her small frame supporting his weight. "Lean on me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Lean on me." Together, they staggered into the cabin, into the new room he had built for her. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air. She helped him to the simple cot he had built, and he collapsed onto it, a low groan escaping his lips. The adrenaline was fading, and a deep, throbbing agony was taking its place. She worked with a frantic, focused purpose, tearing a clean sheet into strips for bandages, heating water over the fire, as she gently peeled the blood-soaked shirt away from the gash in his shoulder. He hissed in pain. The wound was deep, a ragged tear in the muscle. She looked at it, her stomach churning, then looked at his face, pale and beaded with sweat. He had done this for her. He had bled for her. The last of her guilt, the feeling that she was a curse upon him, washed away in a flood of fierce, protective love. She cleaned the wound as best she could, flushing it with whiskey, which made him cry out and clench his fists. She bandaged it tightly, her touch gentle but sure. By the time she was done, a fever had taken hold. He was shivering despite the warmth of the room, his eyes glassy. He began to murmur, his mind adrift on a sea of pain and memory.
Belle,
He whispered, his eyes unfocused.
is that you, Belle?
The old pet name, the one he had used during that long-ago summer, pierced her heart. He was seeing her not as the broken woman she had become, but as the girl he had loved. He was lost, somewhere between then and now.
I'm here, Clay,
She said softly, stroking his sweat-dampened hair from his forehead.
I'm right here. Don't leave,
He mumbled, his hand weakly searching for hers.
Swear you won't leave me again. I swear,
She choked out, tears streaming down her face.
I'll never leave you.
She sat with him through the night, keeping a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, giving him sips of water, as he drifted in and out of a restless sleep. She found herself talking to him, her voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet room. She told him things she had never told another soul.
When I was a little girl,
She whispered, her voice catching.
before I ever met you,
I used to have this dream. It wasn't about a big house or fine dresses. I dreamt I would marry a man who saw me. Not my father's name, not the land he owned. Just me, a man with kind hands and a quiet strength. A man who would build me a home, not buy me one. She looked around the simple, perfect room, the tears falling freely now.
he looked a lot like you, Clay.
Toward dawn, his fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in a chair beside the cot, her head resting on her arms, her hand still loosely holding his. He was weak, and his shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent fire. But his mind was clear. He had won. The past was finally, truly gone, and the future was asleep in a chair beside him. As the first rays of sunlight streamed into their new room, they shared another night of passion. It was nothing like the first. Desperate time by the fire. This was slow and tender and deeply reverent. It was a silent conversation of promises kept and futures to be built. It was no longer about healing old wounds, but about celebrating a new beginning. It was the quiet, certain joy of two people who had fought their way back to each other through a decade of hell, and had found their way home. The next morning, while Isabel still slept, Clay moved stiffly from the bed. He went to the corral and approached Boulder, who nickered softly. With his good hand, he carefully took a long, strong strand of hair from the horse's black tail. He sat on the porch steps, the rising sun warming his face, and with slow, deliberate fingers, he began to weave. He braided the single strand of hair into a small, intricate, and surprisingly beautiful ring. It was a circle of the West, a symbol of his life, his land, and his steadfast heart. He went back into their room and knelt by the cot. He gently took her hand and slipped the simple, dark ring onto her finger. Her eyes fluttered open, looking first at his face, then down at her hand. She stared at the horsehair ring, her breath catching in her throat. "It's not much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's all of me. It's this land. It's my promise." He looked her in the eye, his own gaze clear and certain. "Marry me, Isabel Grant. Be my wife." She looked at the ring, then back at his face, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her lips. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy.
"Yes,"
she whispered.
"Oh, Clay. Yes."
They did not get married in a church. They did not seek the approval of Reverend Miller or the town of Redemption. Their union was not for public consumption or societal absolution. It was for them. They stood under the vast, ancient arms of the oak tree where they had carved their initials as teenagers, the place where he had found her broken in the storm. Their only witness was a grizzled, bow-legged old ranch hand named Silas, a man of few words who had worked for Clay for the past 5 years and whose loyalty was as solid and unquestionable as the mountains on the horizon. Silas, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a clean shirt, read a few simple verses from a worn Bible he'd produced from his saddlebag. Clay, his left arm in a sling but his right hand holding hers firmly, spoke his vows in a low, steady voice, promising not heaven and riches, but his strength, his protection, and his heart for all the days of his life. When it was her turn, Isabel looked at Clay, her eyes shining, and she did not speak of obedience or duty. She spoke of homecoming.
I was lost,
She said, her voice clear and strong.
and you found me. I was broken, and your love is making me whole. I promise to be your partner, your comfort, and your home, just as you are mine. I am not the girl who runs away. I am the woman who stays.
He slid the horsehair ring, a perfect dark circle, back onto her finger. He kissed her then, a long, deep kiss that sealed not just a marriage, but a reclamation of a life that had been stolen from them both. It was a quiet, profound moment of peace, as pure and sacred as any ceremony held under a vaulted cathedral ceiling. That peace lasted less than a week. The note was pinned to the cabin door with a rusty Bowie knife, driven deep into the wood. Clay found it at dawn. The handwriting was a crude, menacing scrawl. Morrison, we hear you're collecting damaged goods. That's a fine piece of land for a man with such poor taste. Too fine. We want it. Be gone by the next full moon. Leave the cattle. And the woman, we'll find a use for her. The Black Creek Gang. Clay tore the paper from the knife, his hand crushing it into a tight ball. The Black Creek Gang were a pack of local vultures led by a man named Finn Cutler, known for preying on isolated homesteads, taking what they wanted through fear and brutality. They had never dared to bother him before. His reputation as a reclusive, hard man had been its own defense. But now, things were different. They saw the fight with Elias Vance. They heard the gossip about Isabel, and they smelled weakness. They saw a man distracted, a homestead with a perceived stain on it, a prize ripe for the taking. The crude, ugly words about Isabel were not just an insult. They were a declaration that his home, and everything in it, was considered forfeit. "What is it?" Isabel asked, coming to stand behind him in the doorway. He didn't want to show her, didn't want to let their poison touch her, but he had vowed she would be his partner, and their life would have no more secrets. He uncurled his fist and handed her the crumpled note. He watched as she read it, her face paling, but her jaw setting in a hard, determined line. She did not cry or shrink away. The girl who would have done so was gone. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "We fight," he said simply. "Silas," he called. "Get the rifles. We're barricading the windows." For the next few nights, sleep was a luxury they could not afford. They took turns on watch, a rifle never far from their hands. The full moon grew, a fat silver eye in the night sky, watching and waiting. The nights were filled with an unbearable tension. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sending a jolt of adrenaline through them. On the third night, under the full, cold light of the moon, they came. The attack began not with a bang, but with a blood-curdling whinny of a horse from the corral. Then the night exploded into chaos. Gunshots shattered the windows of the cabin, the splintering of wood and the demonic. Whooping cries of the attackers filled the air. There were at least half a dozen of them, dark figures on horseback, circling the cabin like wolves. Clay, Silas, and Isabel were ready. They returned fire from the barricaded windows, the roar of their rifles a deafening counterpoint to the assault. Clay's shoulder was a blaze of agony. Firing a rifle with his good arm sent jarring shockwaves through his injured body, but he ignored the pain, his face a grim mask of concentration. Silas, a veteran of some long-forgotten war, was methodical and calm, making every shot count. Isabel's role was to load. She worked frantically, her hands moving with a speed she didn't know she possessed, pouring powder and ramming shot into the spare rifles. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the cabin, stinging her eyes. For a moment, the terrified girl from the desert threatened to resurface. Her hands shook and her heart hammered against her ribs. Then she looked at Clay, his face pale with pain but resolute, fighting for her, for their home. The fear solidified into a cold, hard rage. They would not take this from her. She had lost everything once. She would not lose it again. A bullet tore through the wall near Silas's head, and the old man grunted, slumping to the floor, a dark stain spreading on his thigh. "I'm hit," he yelled.
"Isabel, see to him!"
Clay shouted, firing again into the darkness. She dragged the old man away from the window, pressing a wad of cloth against the wound to stanch the bleeding. Now they were down to one gun. A flaming torch arced through the air, landing on the roof of the barn. Orange flames began to lick at the dry timber, casting the entire homestead in a flickering, hellish light. They were trying to burn them out.
"They're coming for the door!"
Clay yelled. He fired his last shot and reached for the rifle she was supposed to be loading. It was empty. She hadn't had time. Two of the outlaws, emboldened by the fire and the lull in their defense, charged the cabin on foot, a heavy log between them to use as a battering ram. The first blow shuddered through the entire structure. The heavy oak door groaned but held. The second blow sent cracks spidering across the wood. Clay grabbed his pistol, a six-shooter with only a few rounds left. He stood before the door, his body a last, desperate line of defense. As the third blow struck and the door lock shattered, a stray bullet from the circling riders flew through the splintered opening. It caught Clay in his right leg, just above the knee. His leg buckled, and he went down with a sharp cry of pain, his pistol clattering across the floor. The outlaws outside gave a triumphant roar. They were about to pour in. In that instant, Isabel saw their entire future about to be extinguished. She saw Clay, bleeding on the floor, Silas wounded and groaning, and the home they had built about to be consumed by violence. Everything she had fought for, everything she had found, was about to be turned to ash. And something inside her snapped. She snatched up the heavy rifle from beside Clay. It was the one Silas had been using. It was loaded. She had never fired a gun this large in her life. But there was no time for hesitation. As the first outlaw, a large, bearded man with cruel eyes, burst through the broken door, she raised the rifle, braced it against her hip, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her back against the wall, her shoulders screaming in protest. But the roar of the gun was a sound of absolute defiance. The outlaw was thrown backward, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, and fell out of the doorway. His partner, who was right behind him, froze in his tracks, staring at the small, fierce woman standing over her fallen husband, her eyes blazing with a protective fury he had never seen before. He turned and fled into the night. The sudden, brutal end to the charge seemed to spook the rest of the gang. They had expected a wounded rancher and a frightened woman, not a she-lion defending her den. They exchanged a few more sporadic shots. Then their whoops and cries faded into the distance as they retreated, leaving the burning barn to illuminate their failure. The battle was over. The silence that descended was broken only by the crackle of the flames from the barn and Clay's ragged, pain-filled breathing. The sun was rising, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of pink and gray. By the time she had managed to drag Clay to their bed and tourniquet his leg, the barn was a smoldering ruin. But the cabin had held. Silas was propped against a wall, pale but alive. She worked on Clay, her hands no longer trembling. She dug the bullet from his leg with the point of a heated knife, her movement steady as she ignored his grunts of pain. She cleaned and bandaged this new wound, and then the gash on Silas's leg. She was no longer just a wife or a partner. She was a protector, a survivor. When she was finished, she collapsed into the chair beside the bed, utterly exhausted, her body bruised, her ears ringing. Clay reached for her hand, his grip weak but firm. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with a fierce, burning pride. She squeezed his hand, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "I'm not the girl who runs away anymore," she said, her voice quiet but unbreakable in the dawn's first light. "I'm the woman who stays." The seasons turned, pulling the land from the harsh glare of summer into the softer, golden light of autumn. The scorched earth healed, and so did they. The barn, once a blackened skeleton against the sky, was rebuilt, its new pine boards smelling of sap and promise. A few neighboring ranchers, men who respected grit more than gossip, had ridden over to help Clay raise the frame. The story of the fight against the Black Creek Gang had spread, eclipsing the whispers about Isabel's past. In the West, courage was a currency that bought a respect money never could. Clay Morrison was no longer just a recluse, and his wife was no longer a disgraced woman. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were home. Clay's leg and shoulder mended, leaving him with a slight limp and a network of scars that told the story of his devotion. He moved with a new purpose, the old, haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. The change in him was most apparent on Saturday afternoons. He began offering riding lessons to the children from the surrounding homesteads. The sight of the once solitary man patiently guiding a small child's hands on the reins of a gentle mare became a common one. He taught them not just how to ride, but how to be fearless and kind, how to respect the land and the animals that lived on it. He was giving back a part of himself, filling the silence of his ranch with the laughter of the next generation. Isabel found her own purpose. News of her stand during the attack had reached the ears of women who understood what it meant to be an outcast. A young widow shunned for remarrying too quickly. A saloon girl trying to build a new life. A woman whose husband had abandoned her and her children. They began to find their way to the Morrison Ranch. In the new room Clay had built for her, Isabel started a small, informal school. She taught them to read the labels on tins in the general store, to write their own names, to decipher a contract. She gave them more than letters. She gave them a voice. She, who had been silenced for so long, was now teaching others how to speak. The room, once a symbol of her belonging, became a sanctuary for others who felt they belonged nowhere. And in the quiet moments, a new life grew within her. It was a secret they kept to themselves for a long time, a precious, fragile hope. Clay would come in from the fields, his hands calloused and smelling of earth, and gently place his palm on her still flat stomach, a look of profound wonder on his face. This was the ghost he had mourned, the child of their youth, being given a second chance. This was the future, a tiny, insistent flutter that promised to fill all the empty spaces of their past. Their love was not a grand, poetic thing. It was in the way he brought her a wildflower from the prairie, the way she saved him the last piece of pie, the way they moved around each other in the small cabin in a silent, easy dance. It was a love forged in loss, tested by violence, and tempered into something stronger than steel. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow, bloody descent, Clay saddled 2 horses. "Come on," he said to her, a gentle smile touching his lips. "Let's go for a ride." He didn't have to say where. She knew. They rode south, toward the edge of the true desert, the horses' hooves kicking up the same red dust that had coated her wedding dress on that first day. The land was unchanged, a vast, beautiful, and brutal expanse, but they were not the same people who had crossed it. They reached the withered mesquite tree, its skeletal branches clawing at the sky. This was the spot, the place where he had found her, a heap of torn lace and despair, a life away. They dismounted and stood for a long moment in silence, looking out at the endless horizon. The wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and dust. It was the same wind, the same light, the same profound silence. "I was so afraid that day," Isabel said softly, her voice almost carried away by the breeze.
I thought my life was over. I thought the desert had come to claim me.
It did, Clay said, his voice a low rumble. It claimed you for me. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his hands coming to rest protectively over the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. She leaned back against his chest, his solid warmth a comfort against the cooling air. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sky bleed from orange to deep crimson. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his lips close to her ear.
I remember the first time I saw you,
he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that a decade of solitude had failed to extinguish.
Lying right here, a stranger in a ruined dress, a problem I didn't want.
He paused, his embrace tightening, pulling her deeper into him.
I thought you were just a stranger, lost and alone.
He turned her slightly, so he could see her face, her eyes reflecting the fiery colors of the sky.
Turns out,
he said, his voice breaking with the weight of the revelation, a truth that had become the center of his entire world. You were my everything all along. She turned in his arms and kissed him, a kiss that held no desperation or grief, only a deep and abiding love. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a soft, purple twilight. The harshness of the land was softened, its sharp edges blurred. The sky above was a fierce, passionate red, the color of a heart that had been broken and bled, only to be healed and made stronger. There, on the edge of the wilderness that had tried to break them both, surrounded by a brutal beauty, their love stood, quiet, gentle, and as eternal as the land itself. Thank you for listening to this story around our campfire. We'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so drop a comment below and let's connect. Your thoughts and feelings mean the world to us. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales of love, loss, and survival from the American frontier.